Do you have a story that feels flat, like it's too much of the same thing, or that the story concept is too generic? Or do you have a story that is juggling with a lot of different moods, concepts, potential genres, and you're having a hard time making it into a cohesive whole? If either of these apply to you, then let's consider thinking deeper about effectively combining genres. Sometimes you'll start off with a genre in mind that you want to write, but be open creatively to the potential that maybe this story could have other moods working within it. So for some stories, you may want to stick to having a main genre for it, but then you could add a little bit of spice from elements of other genres. Other times, perhaps your story idea could work better if you were to make it more of an equal balance from the elements of between two different genres. So on one hand, many stories have a main overall archetype that they stick to, but then they can often have elements of other types of stories working within it. For example, a lot of these story structures can have room for a romance plot or elements of comedy to lighten things up throughout the climactic scenes. And then on the other hand, you could have two genres that maybe complement one another, like thriller and horror. With thriller, you got more regular events and situations that are really suspenseful and tension-based. And then there can be even less normal, more supernatural horror elements that are even that much more dramatic. Or they could even be genres in opposition to each other, such as horror and comedy. You may think that these opposing genres would conflict, and they certainly can if done wrong. Like if you have an epic yet lighthearted action story. If the characters are making all kinds of jokes or things just come off as being goofy, when there's supposed to be a serious large-scale conflict going on, then they both kind of take away from the other. Because if the story isn't know when to be serious or when to be lighthearted, then it kind of becomes a chaotic jumble if you aren't more conscious of what you want exactly out of these scenes. But opposing genres can work well together. Think of it like complementary colors on a color wheel. You got two colors that are on opposite sides of the wheel, but when you put these shades together, they'll complement each other and strike an opposing balance. So in this example, comedy works well with horror because it can give times of relief. You wouldn't want it to be scary event after scary event throughout the whole story because it'll just wear down your audience. But if you add more contrast, then when you have a more lighthearted scene, and then build up to a horrifying scene, you brought that person that's viewing your story from cheer back into being scared, so it's not flat all the way through. They get to experience that feeling of being scared all over again, and it becomes more like a moving wave of emotion. You could even plot this out on a graph if you really want to see how the plot is affecting the emotions of the audience. You want it to be like a roller coaster, where the gravity of the hills take you down into the lower points, and that builds up enough momentum to make the next hill another exciting part of the journey. So let's say you have a high intensity fantasy story that's big on battles of epic proportions, but you don't know how to go about writing the rest of the parts of the story. Well, if you think of it in terms of contrast, then perhaps it'd do your story good to maybe have some mystery elements. Like there could be a plot of political intrigue that the characters have to get to the bottom of, and this mysterious political conflict is what's causing these wars to start. Or instead, maybe you could add parts of the story in between the battles that are more slice of life, where we get to see the everyday lives of the characters and the smaller drama that goes on in between them, while they're having to live in this world that's constantly going through times of peace and times of war. That's just an example, but try to get creative with how you combine and contrast the different genres that may be in your story. Later in this video, I'll show you what it could look like to chart out how we can make these different genre elements work with each other in the story. But the big point here is that story ideas can come from the combining the genres. So this is an opportunity to think outside the box, because if you were to take a genre that you might not normally use when writing a story and try to combine it with something you already got, then maybe that could be the missing piece that you need for your story. Or if you just simply try to take two different genres that people don't normally put together, then you can come up with something new that way. So before we work on how we actually integrate our genres, there's one more thing I want you guys to consider, which is try to think more detailed about your genre than the bare bones genres that are out there. So many people might label their story as fantasy, yet not knowing that there's different subgenres of fantasy out there. So, for example, there's grimdark fantasy, which is obviously much more dark, much more brutal. You got steampunk and stuff like that. There's high fantasy, which is like the really epic, like fantastical type of fantasy, like Tolkien, for example. There's also urban fantasy, which takes place in urban environments, but it has fantasy story elements combined with it. Or if you were to look at sci-fi, there's different types of sci-fi out there too. So there's like, you got space opera, there's also military sci-fi, which is more focused on military type of characters going out in space and maybe fighting aliens or whatever. So if you're really curious, then I'm sure there's lots of lists of all these different subgenres that are out there, so I would definitely take a look at those if you're seeking to define what your genre might actually be in a more detailed sense. So I was mentioning earlier that when combining genres, it really helps to chart out how these different genres could play with or against one another and how they interrelate in the story. So we're going to do that now. I'll show you an example of what that might look like. So you can either do this on paper, or you can use some kind of software that has a bubble graph that you can make. This program's called Trillium, and in it you can make all kinds of notes, but you can also go up here and insert a new tab, and then you can choose some other text or a bunch of options, and one of these is called Canvas, and then you can use this to make your own bubble graph and put text in each of the bubbles. So in this example, let's say I'm making an action adventure story, and to spice it up, maybe we make it a grim dark horror, and then maybe to contrast with that, we put in a bit of comedy / slice of life, and then we also put in mystery. So let's say I was just writing a story, just starting from these different genre ideas and trying to put them together, but I don't have the specific idea for the story yet. Well, just starting from this can give me some ideas, and we can figure out how each of these genres can interrelate with each other. So since we have both action adventure and horror, then a definite possibility could be that the protagonist encounters the horror monsters, and when he encounters them, he tries to fight them off. So now we got a mix of action and horror working in our potential scenes, and they're working together. And since we have mystery and horror, then maybe there's some kind of mystery behind all this supernatural stuff that's going on. So for this example, we could just say that monsters started appearing in the town, and no one knows why. So they have to figure that out throughout the story. And then that gives me an idea that the moments in between when they're solving the mystery, there could be more slice of life moments as they live their life and have to deal with unraveling this mystery. So now we can kind of get a general sense of how these different genres would actually play out in the plot. But we can go even more detailed than that. So since we started off saying this was an action adventure, then maybe we should put more of those kind of elements into it. So one possibility is that the protagonist gets into fights with other humans / people that are getting in the way of solving this mystery, and that might be trying to hide it. So since we've got horror and mystery here, I was thinking maybe that these monsters can disappear or turn invisible. But if the protagonist is fighting these monsters, it would make more sense if they're like actual flesh and blood monsters at the same time. And zombies get pretty overdone. I think it would make more sense for these guys to be demons. So since this is mystery and action adventure at the same time, then maybe these demons start off as invisible. Something triggers them to become visible, and maybe the protagonist has to find out why they've appeared. So maybe since these demons start off invisible, then that could give an opportunity for some comedic moments perhaps, where people are humorously messed around with by an invisible force. And to add some ironic humor to the situation, maybe the protagonist gets blamed for it, despite it not being him. And to sort of connect the whole idea of comedy and horror even more, then maybe there could be characters that have a dark sense of humor when it comes to the situations that they find themselves in. So that's just a basic example. In this one we started from scratch, basically just starting with the different possible genres we could have and then worked from there. But you can also apply this method to the story you're working on. And I hope this shows you how you can really plan out how these different genres can interrelate and interconnect with each other and play with each other against one another. So try to get creative and think really deeply about that when you try this out. Because if you actually go more in depth like this, then it can help you come up with some ideas for how these different genres can connect that you might have never thought about before, just by slapping together some different possible genres. So it can really add depth and make your story more cohesive that way. So if you have some different genre ideas that you want to integrate into your story, then I urge you to try that method out. And if you like this video, then make sure to comment, give it a like, I'd really appreciate it. And also subscribe to my channel so that way you can get notified for future videos like this that come out. And I wish you guys the best luck with your writing. Peace.